This is the M808 Scorpion from Halo, and this is my USS model of the Scorpion. It has a bunch of details and features from the games, such as a rotating and elevating turret, and movable and positionable treads. There are a few more features that you might not expect, but I'll get to that later. First, I'm going to talk about why I chose to build the Scorpion, and more specifically, this version of the Scorpion. So unlike other videos, I'm not going to go into the role that the Scorpion plays in the UNSC military. It's a tank. Okay, it's a bit large to be practical, but still, it's a tank. And to be honest, I've heard that deciding and talking about what is a tank and what is not a tank is a whole can of worms, so I'm not even going to bother. Instead, what I am going to talk about is why I chose this specific version of the Scorpion to make. Officially, in Universe, there's two main versions of the Scorpion. There's the M808B version and there's the M808C version, with the B version having the coaxial machine gun as opposed to the secondary gunner position. But in terms of in-game variants, there are a variety of styles that I could choose. So first there's the B version, which is from Halo CE and 2, and obviously this has the coaxial machine gun. Then we have the Halo 3/ODST version, which I would say is a little bit more tactical and loaded with spades and pickaxes and things like that on the sides. It's also a bit more beaten up and war-torn, and obviously this is the version that comes with the secondary gunner. There's also the Reach and Infinite variant, which also has the side gunner, but has a very different aesthetic, looking a little bit more sleek and sci-fi, and definitely less beaten up than the Halo 3 version. Finally, we have the Halo 5 version, and I'm not even going to consider it, as like most of 343's redesigns, it's just worse in pretty much every way, and just is a complete U-turn on the unique aesthetic that Bungie established for the games. So I ended up choosing the Halo 3 version for a few reasons. Firstly, the best tank battles in Halo use this variant, from using it in the Ark to press through the desert, all the way to the Scarab battle in the Covenant. Some of Halo 3's tank missions are simply the best. And then you get to use it again to fight on the streets of New Mombasa, and ultimately use the Scorpion to escape with the rest of Alpha 9. For me, these are indisputably the best armor missions the Halo series has to offer currently. Secondly, in this vehicle especially, I feel it's indicative of the state of humanity during this era. It's beaten up, has all sorts of gear strapped to the sides. Not to mention that when these vehicles are dropped off, they're pre-used, they're war-torn, and they've been patched up. The state of the vehicle tells the story of the desperation of humanity, on the back foot and using what it can to survive, as opposed to the Reach aesthetic of the Scorpion, which looks fairly new and fresh straight off the production line. So yeah, I really have a soft spot for this version, and I immediately knew that this is the one that I wanted to make. So now, let's look at all the features the model has to offer. As you would expect from a tank, the main turret rotates and elevates. The secondary gunner turret also rotates and elevates. The driver hatch flips up and can just about fit a figure into the driver position. The secondary gunner turret also fits a figure, and each of the 4 side pods have a handle to allow a figure to ride along. So just like in game, these track pods can also rotate up and down as suspension. But not only that, they are actually sprung, so this means that they simply don't fully droop when raised. They do droop, but they still have the freedom of movement to be moved either way on top of that. This is a pretty nice feature to have, as they don't just clang around whenever you're moving the entire model around. The tracks do move, but barely. They're very stiff, and they are also a bit short to cover the full length of each side pod. Finally, there are a couple of unconventional storage areas in this model. They're not the easiest to access, but they are present. The sloped area next to the cockpit can be removed. I haven't yet detailed this interior, but do want to create an ammunition store or ammunition carousel in here at some point. Secondly, there's a hatch at the back that is accessible as well. This relatively easily pops off to show a hollow interior underneath the turret. So like the other area, yes, I haven't detailed this yet either. I want to add in an engine in this area and a bunch of engine detailing as well. So as always, this is not my first version of the Scorpion, so I just want to quickly show you the previous version to show you where I learned and improved from and where the original inspiration came from. Honestly, I think this is maybe a slightly embarrassing first try. The main body of the vehicle ended up being quite simplistic and was never really that sturdy, so it actually fell apart a fair amount. And I never actually finished the gunner turret on this because it's just a little bit of a complex thing to do and I just never bothered. So as I wasn't comparing these builds to scaled printouts, some of the proportions I just got flat out wrong. I think you can see this in the treads. They are way too small. So during this build I did put a heavy emphasis on a low profile to make sure that the treads weren't taller than the actual figures themselves. But I guess I just ended up getting the rest of the proportions way off and it just looked a bit funny now. Likewise, the turret was just a bit simplistic and just never looked right. Also, the mechanism for which it hinged around never held it properly, so it was just drooping all the time. Enough of that though, let's look again at the details of the new version. So looking at the new version, the proportions, the scale and the details are just in another world. This was the first model that I built using a scaled orthographic view that I then printed out to use as a template. And this was super helpful with proportions and just knowing exactly what detail I could fit and where I could fit it. It also really helps just keep everything in scale because you could tell right away if you were building way larger or way smaller than necessary. So the whole model comes out to about 28 by 20 by 12 centimeters, which ends up coming very close to the scaled size. Because the Scorpion is a tank, and a big tank, there's a lot of space to do quite a lot in terms of detail. It's actually pretty surprising though that once you account for the gunner section, the driver section, and where I put the suspension, there wasn't a huge amount of internal volume left. There was still a fair bit more internal volume than pretty much every model I've done so far. So I used this extra flexibility to put particular effort into smoothing out some of the armoured sections on the hull. This is nice as you don't get a lot of ugly slope overlap that comes from stacking slopes together. The front section I am particularly proud of as you have two separate angles that have to both meet together and it just looked great. Other areas of detail that I'm also particularly fond of are the left engine exhaust section and the rear engine exhaust section. I just used a few particularly novel ways to make them and I really like how they turned out. So with the tread pods, I paid particular attention once again to the height and scaled them appropriately. With these I'm especially happy how I managed to angle the sides to be just like the in-game model. I also used black parts to emulate larger treads as the standard tread size would not fit the entire length. When I eventually get my hands on the new interlocking tread sections, then I'll definitely update this to have some treads that will fit the entire pod. The driver section was definitely a little bit of a squeeze and is lacking details as a result. I'm very happy with how the hatch turned out though. It was really nice to actually finally build the secondary turret. I never tried it before because I didn't really know exactly how I'd go about doing it. Ultimately, I figured out by having the whole turret rotate around a single pin in the base. It does come out, but it is relatively easy to replace and you can easily put figures in it and then put the entire sub-assembly into the model. For those wondering about how I sprung the suspension with elastic bands, I used axles from each of the rods that protrude into the body of the Scorpion. These connect to a couple of Technic arms that then have elastic bands looped around them and attached to the main body. It was definitely a challenge to squeeze them in, but I did do it in the end. The curved rear sections leading to the back were another particularly difficult point. What I ended up doing was just putting some plates there, which is alright, but could probably be improved upon. Gotta say that the turret turned out fantastically. I mean, sure, it doesn't have the barrel movement feature, but it also means that there's no compromise in the look and the design of the turret. And when you compare it to Mega's models, it shows. I think the turret's front top angle, probably the single most important angle to get the look of the Scorpion, and I think it's where the recent sets compromise on. The rest of the turret is likewise sleek and accurate to the in-game model. As the elevating section of the Scorpion turret is so front heavy, it can be really difficult to not have the entire section just droop all the time. Thankfully though, unlike previous versions, the turret is stiff enough to hold any position. The under-turret curved section was particularly interesting to try to emulate, as the turret needs a large internal cavity when the barrel is fully lifted. So as a compromise, I split it into 2 sections, which means that you don't get this awkward gap when the cannon is fully elevated. On the whole, this model is pretty robust, but there are a few weak points to bear in mind when handling it. The rear hatch can sometimes just pop off if you're not careful with where you're lifting the model from. A tile on the midsection of the body is only connected by 1 stud, so sometimes it can be displaced accidentally. And one of the front slopes can be a little bit fragile at times. So when comparing it with Mega's other Scorpion sets, we have to start with the original first wave Halo Wars Scorpion. And I've got to say that this is one of the strongest sets in that first wave. Obviously it was based on the Halo Wars Scorpion, so the turret's bound to be completely different anyway. The rest of the body was on the small side, and you only had enough space for 1 driver, but I think on the whole that's forgivable. Its biggest problem is that the top of the tread pod met at the same height as the front lower section of the Scorpion, and that is not accurate to the design. And you'll see this become a sticking point at pretty much all of Mega's Scorpion designs. I'm going to quickly skip over the Odst Scorpion, as it does have a very similar construction to the original, just with different tread covers really. Then we have Mega's third Scorpion, which is based on the Halo 5 design. As I've already said, I don't like this design, so I'm not really going to critique it in any way, but it's great for collecting parts though. Next we have the Halo Designer Series set. And this is a pretty cool set, and a huge update on the basic design. Unfortunately though, it still has the same basic problem that the original Scorpion had, which is that the tread covers meet at the same height of the body, which is just not right. They've also added in this firing mechanism into the turret, which is cool until you realise that the front angle slopes of the Scorpion's gun are completely the wrong angle, and I think the main reason why they decided to do this was so that they could accommodate the extra section for this mechanism. It's not worth it for me though. And finally, we have Mega's latest Scorpion, which is the Scorpion Clash. And the first thing I'll say is, they raised the body above the treads. But this does come at a cost though. Do you remember what I said earlier about making the treads to not be taller than a figure? Well, I think this is why it's taken them so long to make the model more accurate. It's because without making the treads more compact, the entire model just looked way too top heavy and tall. And combine that with a very similar designed turret that isn't particularly accurate either, and add in the colour, and I'm just not a huge fan of this set. Don't get me wrong, I really appreciate the fact that Mega's massively improved upon their previous designs, but I think there's a long way to go to get a good Scorpion design. I'm sure I'm being a bit unfair, as they do have to factor in sturdiness and how suitable it is for a set, etc. But yeah, this isn't it for me, to be honest. And maybe that's a big reason why I really love this build. Out of everything I've built so far, it has definitely taken me the longest to build, but the amount of space that this vehicle has allowed me the latitude for me to just get everything just right. And maybe what makes this MOC so striking is that I feel there has yet to be a set that really captures the essence of a Scorpion. Don't get me wrong though, there are definitely a few improvements that I see could be made to this model. There are a few areas that are definitely semi-unfinished, such as the internal sections. It would be nice to get more detail in that driver section as well. There are a few other areas that also could do with a refresh, such as the treads with the new interlinking treads whenever I get them. The track pods could also do with having a few extra tools and gear on the side. And I might eventually have another go at that rear sloped section. But other than that, I can't really think of any other areas of improvement. This build has turned out so well that it's even inspired me to want to tackle the Reach/Infinite version one day. And you never know, maybe even eventually a Grizzly way down the line. Honestly, it would be great to see everyone be able to get their hands on a build like this. Unfortunately though, without anything like Bricklink or a Mega part picker, the only feasible way for most to build this is if Mega actually built a set like this, and I'm not sure why they don't. They seem to be angling themselves much more towards the adult market. I mean, just look at the Needler, the Energy Sword, the most recent Forward Unto Dawn, and recently the Guilty Spark set. So I'm not really sure why they can't take this philosophy and apply it to figure size sets. Just because it's a figure scale set doesn't mean they have to design it for a younger demographic. So moving forward, it would be great to see them pushing the bounds of what can be done in this scale. Take this build as an example. I mean, sure, it does have its drawbacks and it's bound to need a redesign, but I don't see anything major with this build that would make it fundamentally incompatible with the market. I would get a set made to this standard in a heartbeat. So who knows, maybe Mega might eventually see this and see that there's a market for a set like this. With that, liking, subscribing, watching the video to the end and commenting will all help the channel. And who knows, maybe one day we might see a set like this come out. Until then though, thank you so much for watching. I'm Reforger, and I'll see you next time.